You stand in a world that tells you your burdens are natural, your suffering inevitable, your position predetermined by laws older than memory. But I declare to you, the chains you carry were not forged by your hands, they were placed upon you by a system that calls itself eternal only because it fears the moment you recognize its fragility. The supposed order you are told to respect is nothing more than the organized power of those who live upon the labor of others, a structure built on expropriation disguised as progress, necessity, and common sense. From the textile mills of Manchester to the factories that choke the air of every industrial town, we see the same law in operation. Those who produce everything possess nothing. Those who produce nothing command everything. This inversion is not an accident of history, but the deliberate arrangement of an economic order that has transformed human beings into mere instruments of profit. The capitalist does not inquire into your needs, your dignity, or your humanity. He asks only how much surplus value he can extract from the hours of your life. Yet this system, which appears colossal and immovable, rests on the most precarious foundation imaginable, your daily labor. Without it, the machines fall silent, capital ceases its circulation, and the glittering world of accumulation collapses into dust. The ruling class trembles not because of the weapons it does not possess, but because of the truth it cannot suppress. The power it exercises flows entirely from the labor it exploits. And here lies the contradiction that capitalism cannot resolve. It proclaims freedom while producing dependence, wealth while manufacturing poverty, progress while deepening alienation. It boasts of individuality, yet compels millions into uniform misery. It promises opportunity but enforces obedience. It shouts of merit while resting on inheritance. It praises competition yet maintains dominance through monopoly and concentrated ownership. Every advance in technique, every new machine, every improvement in productivity, achievements created by the collective genius of workers, becomes another instrument used against those who made it possible. Technology, which could liberate humanity from toil, instead becomes the weapon that intensifies exploitation. The worker becomes an appendage of the machine, subordinated to its rhythm, valued only as long as he can generate profit greater than the cost of his subsistence. But history does not stand still. The contradictions of capitalism sharpen themselves, and the illusions protecting it begin to dissolve. As workers recognize their shared conditions, their common exploitation, the facade of individual struggle gives way to the truth of collective reality. In this recognition emerges something the ruling class has always dreaded: class consciousness. For when you understand not only that you are exploited, but why you are exploited, the first links of your chains begin to crack. Look closely at the social relations that surround you. The state, far from being a neutral arbiter, is the organized power of one class to suppress another. Law reflects ownership, not justice. Education reproduces obedience, not enlightenment. Morality is shaped to preserve hierarchy, not humanity. Yet none of these institutions possess power of their own. They are sustained only by the acceptance, often unconscious, of those subjected to them. Every ruling class throughout history has believed its dominance eternal, and every one has been proven wrong. Feudal lords believed the land and its people were their natural inheritance, until the rising bourgeoisie shattered that conceit. And now the bourgeoisie, intoxicated by its triumphs, imagines it has reached the final form of human society. But capitalism, like the systems before it, carries within itself the seeds of its own negation. For as exploitation intensifies, as inequality grows, as crises recur with increasing violence, the workers who once stood divided come to understand that their liberation depends not on individual escape, but on collective transformation. What appears today as resignation can tomorrow become resolve. What seems fragmented can become unified. What is endured in silence can erupt into a demand for a new social order. I do not appeal to charity, for charity is the confession of injustice. I do not appeal to reform, for reform is the attempt to cure the symptom while preserving the disease. I appeal to the knowledge that arises from material reality itself, A society that depends on your labor, yet denies you the fruits of that labor, is a society in contradiction with its own foundation. When you understand this, you discover the truth that the ruling class has labored tirelessly to conceal. The key to the chains lies not in the hands of those who forge them, but in the hands of those who wear them. The moment you recognize your collective power, the structure that rests upon your subordination begins to tremble. And when the masses see clearly, when they think critically, when they organize consciously, no force on this earth can prevent the transformation of society. The path to a new world does not emerge from faith or hope alone. It emerges from the recognition that history is not the story of individuals acting alone, but of classes in struggle. And in that struggle, you, the producers of all wealth, possess not only the capacity to interpret the world, but the power to change it. The chains of oppression were created by the capitalist system, not by the workers themselves. For no laboring individual enters the world with an instinct for subjugation or with a desire to diminish his own life. The worker is born into a structure whose foundations were laid long before his arrival, a structure that arranges social relations in such a way that the products of his labor do not return to him in the form of freedom or security, but instead accumulate in the hands of those who own the means of production. In this historical arrangement, which emerged from the dissolution of feudalism and the rise of industrial capital, individuals find themselves assigned to roles they did not choose, compelled to participate in an economic order that claims inevitability even as it benefits only a narrow fraction of society. The worker, possessing only his labor power, is required to sell that labor in order to survive, while the capitalist, owning the factories, land, tools, and resources, purchases that labor not to elevate the worker, but to multiply his own wealth. This contradiction does not arise from personal failings, but from the structure of production that capitalism establishes. The worker does not set the price of his labor, determine the conditions under which he works, or claim ownership of what he produces. All of these powers are centralized in the hands of the capitalist class, whose control is legitimized by laws, institutions, and norms that evolved alongside the economic system itself. Thus the chains that bind the worker are not physical chains forged in some distant workshop, but social and economic constraints embedded in the very fabric of daily life. These chains manifest in wages that barely sustain existence while generating profits far exceeding what is returned to the laborer in workdays extended beyond human endurance, in the alienation that arises when one's creative energy is transformed into a mere commodity to be bought and sold. At no point in this process does the worker consciously craft the circumstances that restrict his freedom. He does not design the wage system that undervalues his effort, nor does he erect the hierarchies that place property above human life. He does not establish the market forces that dictate his survival, nor the competition that pits laborer against laborer in a struggle for employment. These conditions emerge from the historical logic of capitalism itself, which requires a class dependent on selling labor for wages in order to function. Capital accumulation depends on extracting more value from the worker than the worker receives, and this imbalance becomes institutionalized over time, creating patterns of inequality that appear natural only because they have been normalized by repetition. Even the ideologies that justify these inequalities are not of the worker's making. The belief that success stems from individual effort, while poverty is the result of personal failure, serves the interests of those who benefit from exploitation, not those who endure it. Such ideas mask the reality that the laborer's position is shaped not by personal shortcomings but by systemic forces that concentrate wealth and power upward. Education, religion, cultural traditions, and public discourse frequently reinforce this illusion, teaching individuals to accept the constraints imposed upon them as unavoidable or even deserved. The workers' chains, therefore, are not simply material but intellectual, formed by narratives that obscure the true origins of inequality. Yet these chains retain their origin in the capitalist system rather than in the will of any individual worker. The laborer participates in the system because survival demands participation, and the system persists because its mechanisms operate independent of the desires of those within it. Machines, factories, markets, and institutions continue functioning regardless of whether the worker endorses the arrangement or suffers under it. This is the peculiar power of capitalism. It compels participation even from those at disadvantages, creating a situation in which individuals may reproduce the very relations that restrict them without intending to do so. Understanding this distinction is essential for grasping the nature of oppression within capitalist society. The burden carried by the worker is not a burden of guilt but of circumstance, and the limits placed upon him are not the result of choices he made but of structures he entered without consent. The chains originate in historical developments, economic imperative, and class relations beyond the control of any single laborer. They are sustained by institutions that reflect the interests of those who own property, not by the will or actions of those who work. All power in society ultimately rests on the exploited labor of the working class. For every institution, every towering structure of wealth, every glittering symbol of authority derives its existence from the ceaseless activity of those who transform raw nature into usable form. No palace could stand, no railway could run, no merchant could trade, no government office could function without the countless hands that build, maintain, and sustain the material conditions of life. The illusion that power rests with those who issue commands or own property arises only because society is being organized so that the true source of power remains obscured beneath layers of hierarchy, ideology, and tradition. But beneath these appearances lies a simple reality. The entire social order depends on the daily labor of those who receive the least from the wealth they create. The ruling classes across history have always sought to claim that power emanates from divine right, noble birth, natural superiority, or the genius of entrepreneurial vision. Yet none of these claims withstand examination when confronted with the concrete processes of production. A king cannot eat his crown. A capitalist cannot assemble machinery with his ledger, and a landlord cannot cultivate the soil with his title deeds. The material world is shaped and reshaped by labor, by the physical and mental effort of those who produce goods, transport materials, repair structures, and operate the machines of industry. Even the bureaucracies and institutions that govern society require the administrative labor of clerks, scribes, and workers whose efforts are rarely acknowledged. Though power appears to reside in boardrooms, parliaments, and mansions, these are merely the command posts, directing the surplus extracted from the laboring masses. This dependence becomes even clearer in the context of industrial capitalism, where production is continuous, coordinated, and highly structured. Factories, mills, and transportation networks require a disciplined workforce whose collective labor produces not only goods but also the profits that fuel the entire economic system. The owners of capital accumulate wealth not through personal exertion but through the difference between what workers produce and what workers are paid. This surplus, appropriated by the capitalist class, becomes the basis of their economic dominance, their political influence, and their ideological authority. Yet the source of that surplus lies entirely in labor. Without the worker operating the loom, tending the furnace, managing the engine, or organizing the accounts, capital would remain inert and useless. Power therefore flows upward from labor, even though it appears to descend from those who own property. The laboring class generates the wealth that finances armies, administration, scientific institutions, and the cultural monuments of civilization. It provides the taxes that support governments, the commodities that fill markets, and the innovations that advance industry. Every material expression of societal power rests upon a foundation laid by countless workers whose names are forgotten even as their contributions remain indispensable. The paradox of capitalism lies in the fact that those who create power systematically denied it, while those who depend on their labor exert authority over them. This relationship persists because the structure of capitalism obscures the worker's role in maintaining the entire system. The division of labor fragments the workforce into specialized tasks, making it difficult to perceive the collective nature of their contribution. Wage labor further disguises exploitation by presenting payment as an equal exchange, even though the worker produces far more value than he receives. The circulation of commodities hides the human labor embedded within them, transforming the worker's effort into abstract exchange value that appears independent of its source. Through these mechanisms, the system ensures that the origins of power remain hidden, allowing those who benefit from exploitation to claim they are the architects of progress. Yet beneath these layers of mystification remains the undeniable fact that production halts the moment labor withdraws. Machines stand silent, markets freeze, and institutions lose their operational capacity. Even the most powerful capitalist, armed with wealth and legal authority, cannot generate value without labor to set his capital in motion. This dependence reveals the true hierarchy of power, one that is concealed in daily life but exposed whenever disruptions occur. At such moments, the facade of authority collapses, and it becomes evident that society functions only through the continuous energy of its laboring members. Historical development itself reflects this underlying truth. Every major transformation in social organization, from feudal agriculture to industrial production, has been driven by changes in the forms and relations of labor. The evolution of technology, the growth of markets, and the rise of cities all rest on the reorganization of work and the distribution of its products. Those who control labor's output wield influence, but those who perform the labor generate the conditions for their influence to exist. The working class, though often constrained, remains the bedrock upon which the entire structure of society stands, its exploited effort the hidden engine of all power. Capitalism produces wealth for a few while generating poverty, alienation, and dependence for the many, for its very structure is built on an unequal distribution of the means of production and an appropriation of surplus that flows inevitably upward. In the capitalist mode of production, wealth is not the spontaneous outcome of individual merit, but the organized result of collective labor, which is then concentrated into the hands of those who own property, rather than those who create value. The owner of capital extracts profit not through personal exertion, but through the difference between what the worker produces and what the worker receives. This difference accumulates over time, expanding the riches of a small class while leaving the laboring majority with only enough to survive and return the next day to the same conditions that deprived them of the fruits of their work. The system disguises this inequality by presenting the capitalist as a risk-taking innovator whose wealth is earned by the daring use of capital, yet the capital itself is nothing more than the stored labor of countless workers. The machines, factories, tools, and raw materials that define modern industry are themselves products of labor, transformed into instruments of control once they become private property. Thus the capitalist class claims ownership of the outcomes of social cooperation, while contributing a fraction of what the working class generates. The result is the accumulation of immense wealth at one pole of society and persistent insecurity at the other. For every luxurious estate, there are thousands of cramped dwellings. For every banquet table, countless workers go hungry. For every fortune, innumerable lives are spent in toil. This economic inequality gives rise to poverty not because society lacks resources, but because the distribution of those resources follows the logic of profit rather than human need. Goods are produced not to enrich the collective life of the community, but to maximize returns for investors. Entire populations may find themselves unemployed or underpaid not because they lack skill or willingness to work, but because the capitalist cannot profit from their labor under existing market conditions. As machines increase productivity, instead of reducing the burden of labor for all, they often displace workers, deepening poverty while expanding profits. Thus, technological progress, though created by collective ingenuity, becomes a force that intensifies inequality when governed by the imperatives of capital. Alongside poverty arises alienation, the silent wound of the capitalist system. The worker is separated from the product of his labor, for he does not own what he creates. It becomes the property of the capitalist the moment it is made. He is alienated from the labor process itself, for he performs tasks dictated by the needs of profit rather than by his own creative faculties or personal fulfillment. Labor becomes mechanical, repetitive, and external to his true nature, a means to survival rather than an expression of human potential. Furthermore, he is alienated from other workers who become competitors in the labor market, rather than collaborators in shared creation. This fragmentation prevents the formation of genuine community, replacing solidarity with suspicion and mutual dependence with rivalry. Alienation also extends to the worker's own sense of self. Reduced to a mere seller of labor power, he becomes defined by the wage he can command rather than by the rich capacities he possesses as a human being. His identity is shaped by forces outside his control, and his value is measured in units of productive output rather than in terms of dignity, creativity, or humanity. The system therefore impoverishes not only his material conditions but also his inner world, dulling the possibility of self-realization and extinguishing the creative spark that labor should nurture. Dependence emerges naturally from these conditions. Deprived of the means of production, the worker must continually return to the capitalist to sell his labor in exchange for wages. This dependence is not born of personal weakness but of structural necessity. Without access to land, tools, or resources, he cannot produce independently, is compelled to participate in a system that offers him no path to autonomy. Even his survival hinges on forces beyond his influence, market fluctuations, business decisions, and technological shifts that may render his labor obsolete. Meanwhile, the capitalist depends on no such external authority, for his control of property grants him freedom of choice, mobility, and the ability to shape the economic landscape according to his interests. The combined effects of inequality, alienation, and dependence ensure that the wealth created by the many is appropriated by the few. Capitalism therefore perpetuates a cycle in which the laboring majority sustains the comfort and power of a minority, not through consent but through economic necessity. While the system presents this arrangement as natural, rational, and permanent, even though it is historically produced and subject to transformation. Class consciousness is the first step toward breaking ideological and economic domination, for domination persists not merely through brute force or economic deprivation, but through the shaping of thought, perception, and belief. In a society organized around private property and the extraction of surplus value, the ruling class maintains its position by ensuring that the exploited do not fully grasp the nature of their exploitation. This concealment is achieved through ideology, through narratives that depict the existing order as natural, eternal, and beneficial to all. As long as the laboring class sees its conditions as isolated misfortune or personal failures rather than expressions of systemic relations, the structure of exploitation remains secure, upheld not only by coercion, but by the acceptance of those who suffer under it. Class consciousness emerges precisely when this veil begins to lift, when individuals recognize their shared position within the economic system and understand that their hardships are not accidental but rooted in the very organization of society. Such consciousness does not arise spontaneously but develops through the experiences of labor itself. In the workplace, workers confront the reality that their labor enriches others while providing them only the means of subsistence. They experience the discipline of the factory, the monotony of repetitive tasks, and the alienation from the products they create. They see their conditions fluctuate not according to their effort or merit, but according to market force, technological changes, and decisions made by owners whose interests diverge fundamentally from theirs. As these experiences accumulate, the illusion of individual destiny begins to crack, revealing the collective nature of exploitation. The worker discovers that the inequalities he faces are shared by millions who toil under similar circumstances, and in this recognition lies the seed of class consciousness. Yet the growth of consciousness is obstructed by powerful ideological forces that seek to fragment workers and prevent them from identifying their common interests. Religion may present earthly suffering as a test, promising reward in another world while discouraging resistance in this one. Education may glorify the achievements of those who accumulate wealth, portraying them as geniuses who earned their privilege rather than beneficiaries of systemic advantage. Political discourse may emphasize national unity or individual aspiration, diverting attention away from economic relations and toward abstract ideals that mask underlying contradiction. Newspapers and cultural institutions often reflect the worldview of those who own them, presenting the capitalist order as the pinnacle of progress and depicting alternatives as dangerous or impractical. These ideological mechanisms ensure that many workers remain unaware of the structural roots of their deprivation. Class consciousness begins to form when individuals question these narratives. It grows as workers compare their lived experience with the story told about their situation and notice the glaring inconsistencies. They observe that wealth grows faster for those who own capital than for those who labor. They notice that crises, unemployment, and wage cuts occur even when productivity is high. They see that technological improvements benefit owners while displacing laborers. Gradually, workers become aware that the interests of the owning class and the laboring class are fundamentally antagonistic, not because of personal hostility, but because of the logic of the economic system itself. Once this realization takes shape, workers begin to see themselves not as isolated actors in a competitive marketplace, but as members of a class whose fate is intertwined. This awakening alters their understanding of society in profound ways. The worker recognizes that the laws, institutions, and moral values of society reflect the interests of the ruling class, not those of the majority. What once appeared as neutral becomes clearly partisan. What once seemed fair reveals itself as an instrument of inequality. The worker no longer perceives poverty as a personal failing but as a structural necessity of a system that requires cheap labor for its survival. He sees that the wealth of the capitalist rests on his own unpaid labor, that the freedoms enjoyed by the few depend on the constraints imposed on the many. This shift in awareness transforms resignation into critical thought and passive endurance into a search for collective understanding. Class consciousness also deepens as workers communicate, organize, and share their experiences. The isolated grievances of individuals become the collective grievances of a class when they are voiced and echoed among others who live under similar conditions. Through discussion, association, and mutual recognition, workers come to understand the scale of their exploitation and the potential strength of their unity. They realize that their power lies not in petitioning the ruling class for relief, but in recognizing their role as the foundation upon which the entire system rests. This insight weakens the ideological hold that the ruling class maintains and exposes the fragility of an order that relies on the ignorance and division of those it exploits. In this sense, class consciousness is the first breach in the ideological fortress that protects economic domination. It marks the moment when workers cease to view their world through the lens provided by their oppressors and begin to interpret it through the realities of their own position within the system. Through this transformation of awareness, the mechanisms of domination lose their invisibility, and the economic structure of society becomes open to critique, analysis, and ultimately the possibility of change. The collective organization of workers is the key to transforming society and ending exploitation, because exploitation persists only so long as individuals confront the economic system in isolation, each burdened by his own struggles and convinced that his condition is merely a personal misfortune rather than a structural necessity. In the capitalist mode of production, workers are deliberately fragmented, competing against one another for wages, positions, and mere survival. This fragmentation serves the interests of those who own property for divide. Workers cannot effectively resist the power that capital exerts over them. As long as each worker stands alone, his labor power appears small, his grievance seems isolated, and his capacity to challenge the system is minimal. But when workers come together, sharing their experiences, pooling their strength, and recognizing their collective role in the production of all wealth, the illusion of capitalist permanence begins to dissolve. Through collective organization, the worker discovers that the weakness attributed to him individually becomes immense strength when multiplied across the class that sustains society. Throughout history, the ruling classes have maintained their dominance, not solely through force, but through the disunity of the oppressed. Masters, nobles, and capitalists alike have relied on the separation of laborers to prevent them from confronting the shared root of their suffering. Capitalism, more than any previous system, refines this division through the wage relation, which compels workers to compete with one another as sellers of labor power. The individual worker stripped of property and confronted with the necessity of earning a livelihood, enters the marketplace. As an isolated figure, pitted against his fellow workers in a struggle for employment, wages, and stability. This competition blinds him to the fact that all workers share the same structural position, the same vulnerability, and the same dependency on those who own the means of production. The result is a condition in which workers reproduce their own subordination by acting as isolated individuals rather than as members of a class with common interests. Collective organization begins when workers see beyond this artificial separation. It emerges in the realization that their conditions are shared, that their struggles are the direct outcome of the economic system, that the power of the capitalist rests on the coordinated labor of thousands who receive only a fraction of the value they create. The worker recognizes that the capitalist's authority is not derived from superior intelligence or exceptional talent, but from his ownership of property that becomes productive only through the labor of others. Once this understanding develops, the logic of organization becomes clear. Only by uniting can workers challenge the economic arrangements that keep them dependent. Collective organization transforms the worker from a solitary individual into a conscious participant in a broader struggle, one that transcends personal hardship and addresses the root causes of inequality. In the factory, the fields, the workshops and the mines, the conditions of labor foster opportunities for solidarity. Workers share the same long hours, the same exhaustion, the same insecurity, and the same alienation from the products of their labor. These common experiences naturally give rise to shared grievances, and shared grievances create the foundation for mutual recognition. Through conversation, cooperation, and collective reflection, workers begin to see their situation not as a series of personal trials but as expressions of a systemic structure that places profit above human well-being. This recognition lays the groundwork for formal organization, whether through associations, committees, societies, or gatherings where workers can articulate their demands and develop strategies to pursue their interests collectively. Such organization is not merely a practical necessity but a profound transformation in consciousness. When workers unite, they discover possibilities that were inconceivable when they acted alone. Collective action reveals that the power of capital is not absolute. It is contingent upon the daily cooperation of the laboring class. The factory cannot operate without its workers, and the flow of capital halts the moment they withdraw their labor. In this realization, workers grasp the true nature of their power, not as isolated individuals, but as a collective force capable of shaping the direction of society. Organization gives them the ability to negotiate from a position of strength, to resist exploitation, and to demand changes that address the structural foundations of their condition. The ruling class understands the significance of worker organization and therefore seeks to suppress it. Laws, institutions, and ideologies arise that portray unity among workers as disruptive, dangerous, or irrational. Efforts are made to divide workers along lines of trade, skill, nationality, or belief. For the ruling class knows that its dominance is endangered the moment workers recognize their shared interests. The resistance to organization is not accidental, it is a deliberate attempt to maintain the imbalance of power that keeps exploitation intact. Yet history shows that once workers begin to organize, the process is difficult to reverse. The development of solidarity, once set in motion, awakens a collective strength that challenges the very foundations of the economic order. Thus, the collective organization of workers represents not only a response to exploitation but the beginning of the transformation of society itself. Through organization, workers move from resignation to understanding, from understanding to unity, and from unity to the possibility of shaping a world in which the conditions of labor reflect the needs and dignity of those who labor. In the end, the forces that shape society are neither mysterious nor unchangeable. They are built on the daily labor, choices, sacrifices, and struggles of ordinary people whose power has been obscured but never erased. Every system that thrives on inequality depends on convincing workers that they are isolated, replaceable, and powerless. Yet, the truth running through history is that no structure of domination has ever withstood the awakening of those who sustain it. When people begin to see the invisible architecture of exploitation that surrounds them, when they recognize that their frustrations are not personal failures but predictable outcomes of a system designed to concentrate wealth and control. The foundations of that system begin to tremble. Class consciousness is not merely an intellectual realization, but a profound shift in self-perception, a moment when individuals understand that their struggles are shared and that their hopes gain strength when bound together rather than pursued alone. Once people grasp that unity is not an abstract ideal, but a practical force capable of reshaping institutions, workplaces, and the social order itself, the idea of change stops feeling distant and becomes something rooted in lived experience. Collective organization becomes the means through which anger is channeled into purpose, through which frustration becomes strategy, and through which isolated voices become a power capable of demanding fairness, dignity, and participation in the decisions that determine the direction of society. No system built on inequality can endure when the people who make it run stand together with clarity about their own worth and with the determination to reshape the conditions of their lives. The future is not written by those who hold power, but by those who discover their own and choose to act in solidarity, turning awareness into strength and strength into transformation.